Daniel, Vanya, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have you both here.
Thank you very much. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Daniel, I mean, for people that aren't on YouTube watching, Daniel's representing with the Ynab shirt. So,
oh yeah, thanks for the swag. I'm a huge proponent of your brand, and also you chose really good quality T-shirt. Like, it's super comfy. So I'll catch my wife wearing it from time to time. So.
Excellent. That's
the only reason I'm not wearing it is because I've been wearing it a lot lately, and it's in the wash right now. But it's definitely one of my favorite shirts.
Well, you clearly just need another one, so then we can solve that problem. In the wash or wearing it. So. You guys, either one of you can fill this. Tell us, everyone, just a little bit about yourselves and the connection you two have.
This is a great question. So this all started a while back when I was 16 in high school, and I was looking for some interesting opportunities to take up my time. And ultimately, I discovered this program called Junior Achievement, which is a program that has different programs available for students to enable them for success in the modern environment. And the particular program that I found was this really cool initiative where a bunch of teenagers were gathered together and helped to start a company. We were lucky enough to be hosted on the eBay campus in San Jose, California.
Sweet.
Yeah, beautiful campus and definitely a very interesting vibe. And we would show up once a week into a room, and we had amazing mentors and volunteers there available who would teach us what it takes to run a business, how to put things together. So that's where I met Daniel, because he was one of the volunteers there. And it was an absolutely fantastic experience.
So you're 16 years old. That 16 is a nice spot because they're old enough where things are interesting to them, things are still new, but they're also like they're everything's new, and so the learning pace can be awesome. That's fantastic. So Daniel, you were working at eBay and a volunteer, or did eBay just kind of facilitate it?
I was working at eBay, and I started the program with a good friend of mine, Sergey Ivashov. So my history with JA goes back, funny enough, similarly to Vanya's. So I've been working with JA for over 25 years. I first started as a student at age 16 in the company program, which is their flagship program. Junior Achievement is the largest not-for-profit that's focused on financial literacy, career readiness, and entrepreneurship. And the company program brings together students from all different regions. I think, Vanya, we had students from 7 different high schools with different socioeconomic backgrounds. They didn't know each other. You had these little cliques. I mean, you learn a ton about what it's like to work in business at a young age before you have to make those tough decisions about what you want to do in university, which mostly get wrong. I mean, that I definitely got it wrong. So, one of the things that I really loved about the program was it helps you learn through mentorship, but more importantly, by doing. So I actually met my wife at age 16 in the company program when she was from a different high school, and I've been helping out ever since. I'm originally from Toronto, and actually when I moved here to Silicon Valley, I was assistant controller for eBay North America. I was shocked that they weren't running the company program. So I approached one of our VPs, got some sponsorship. And at some point, I think in our 3rd year, Vanya, we had 3 concurrent programs running like at the same time. Remember that big wall we had with the different competing companies, and you guys would like riff on each other? I think that was awesome.
That was a blast.
That sounds amazing. My only, people ask, were you always an entrepreneur? And sometimes I don't even like the word because I think it's romanticized. And a lot of times it's just like, you're just figuring stuff out. It kind of makes it sound sexier than it really ends up being. Or they're like, oh, you can set your own schedule. And then you realize that just means you never turn off, So it's there's some weirdness to it. It's more like, what you read on the cover of a magazine or something. But my only, what I would say was a real entrepreneurial experience was balloon twisting, when I would just go to restaurants and pay them a little fee. But you had to learn to approach strangers as a 17, 16-year-old and convince them that they needed a balloon sword. And
get rejected and fail and realize that you're looking for that delight when that smile from that child gets that balloon sword and you don't always get the smile. Like how that feels is is more important than actually what you learn from twisting the balloons. But
absolutely.
That's cool. I'd ask for a demo if we had time, but
yeah, I could do the sword still. I couldn't do the parrot or the motorcycle. That was a little more advanced, and I lost that. It was interesting because I learned that you would learn how to iterate on. You know, you talk about solving problems by doing, and I learned I would go up and say, "Would you guys, would you two like a balloon?" And not all the tables had kids, and so you're like, "Well, I got to ask these two adults here. Do any of you want a balloon?" And it wouldn't pan out. So I learned like, I should say, hey, what color flower balloon does this woman here want, approaching a couple? And then it's this a little bit of a presumptive close, but I didn't read a book to do it. You just do it because you're like, oh, that worked out better. So learning by doing, it doesn't get any better than that. So
yeah, we learned that. So our company, I think, Vanya, you were in 2 years, right? You were a junior.
Just the one, but we did duct tape wallets, and it's kind of interesting that you mentioned the aspect of iteration because, the first few weeks we were just figuring out what's going to stick, and we had a bunch of random ideas. I think we had flower baskets and gift baskets and duct tape wallets and a few other ideas I don't even remember now. And of course, we had no idea which one of them would work out. So I believe we actually ran small scale experiments to see which ones were the easiest to manufacture and kind of which ones had the most input. And we realized that given the limited resources that we have, I think each one of us pulled maybe $20 or $50 as kind of the seeding for the company. We realized that duct tape wallets are the way to go because you just buy a bunch of duct tape, find some reasonable designs, and then you put them together. And I remember an interesting anecdote from trying to get the size right, where, none of us actually had a lot of money or credit cards back then, obviously as 16-year-olds. So I remember we ended up actually approaching our wonderful mentors and we're like, hey, can you hand these strange teenagers your wallet with a lot of money in it, and we're going to put this in the wallets and see if it fits and have you fold it and sit on it and do all these things to figure out what does it actually feel like.
And that specific mentor was Melissa Manuevo, right? Just want to do a shout out there. Yeah,
she was fantastic.
I remember that.
I still remember she handed me a wallet. I think she had like $300 in there, and I'd never held that much money in my life.
Blew your mind. Yeah.
And I was like, you mean you just walk around with $300 in your pocket? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it does blows your mind. You're like, what does it feel like? Yeah, that's very so. I mean, you haven't yet as a 16-year-old, you'd never touched $300, but you mentioned, Daniel, that financial education was a part of the curriculum. Do you mean like businesses, P&Ls, balance sheets, or do you mean on the personal side as well, or both?
For Jay, it's both. The company program is focused on the bookkeeping and accounting side of things. Like we cover basics like assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity. Yeah. We issue stock certificates. So the $20 to $25 times 30 students is your source of capital. We didn't do any debt, although you could have borrowed that $300 and boosted your returns with leverage.
Should have known.
Could have produced more wallets, right?
Yep.
But at the grade school level, I've also volunteered to do this. The JA has programs where mentors go into a school and teach a curriculum. The one that I'm most familiar with is called Dollars and Cents. And it's typically taught to grade 6 to grade 8. And it's about things like, what is money? Where does it come from? What is a check? What is a debit card? What is a credit card? What is a mortgage? Basic financial literacy concepts. In the company program, you realize that not everyone has that same baseline, but that's where the students help each other out. And they also learn by doing. Right? They have to figure out what is a PO? How do you budget for something? Oh, shoot, we're running out of money. What do we do there? How do we plan for that? I almost swore. I apologize.
Oh, it's fine.
And that aspect of learning and, more importantly, asking for help is incredibly powerful, especially at that age. I gotta say, I remember we rated, Vanya, I don't remember this, but duct tape wallets involves duct tape and razor blades, like X-Acto knives, right? Because you're cutting the templates. We rated eBay's first aid kit multiple times. The good news is that when you're young, you heal fast. So
no scars.
The idea of just having people, you kind of seeing the whole pipeline of like product, like conception, testing, getting that fit right. And in your case, it sounds like it was actually fit. I was laughing when you said, you're trying to find something that sticks, and then you chose duct tape wallets, which that to me was just kind of funny. So, so you two, how did you find Ynab? So there's this connection from 16 years ago, but now, I mean, you're on the Ynab podcast. So give me kind of your Ynab origin stories as well.
You tell the story, Vanya, because you're ahead of me.
Yes, no, this was quite entertaining. So on my side, as most folks, had a very simple spreadsheet where I was trying to model future incomes and try to say, okay, 3 months from now, I will spend $20 on movie tickets. And of course, that never worked out. So I knew that I needed a better system in place, but I didn't really have a good way to do it. And I remember after graduating college, I was lucky enough to get a very well-paying job at Google. And my benchmark for whether or not I could afford something was, is my bank account balance high enough? And I would mentally set aside maybe some rent and some expenses, and then I would buy things. And the pivotal moment for me was when I was having lunch with a coworker, and she mentioned she was buying a house in cash. And we had
Whoa.
started at the same time. And I was like, okay, wait,
Oh.
I'm not doing this. You're doing this. And of course, we were lucky enough to be very transparent with our numbers with each other. And we'll touch
Yeah.
upon this later in the podcast. But she actually sat me down. She's like, look, this is how much money I've saved. Here's how I did it. And here's what I'm doing with this. And I was like, oh my God, I have way less than she does. And, this is not at all an ego comparison, but the question is where did it go? So I started trying to find a system. I was like, I need a way to track my money, because I was using Mint and it kind of showed roughly where things were going, but nothing specifically. And I remember I installed, I think, 6 different budgeting apps, and Ynab was one of them. And I used all 6 of them faithfully for 2 months to see which one would stick the best. And specifically, Ynab really stuck out to me because of the zero-based budgeting system, as well as not forecasting future inflows. And something about that just really clicked for me.
I like that.
Now, I guess as far as the connection to Daniel, so I'm a big proponent of sharing my knowledge and trying to showcase my experience in order to help other people. And that involves both onboarding them to Ynab and kind of sharing my other skills. And about a year ago, I had an idea to write up a post with some tips and advice for high income earners, because Ynab is fantastic, but most of the marketing is kind of for more typical folks. And I was like, okay, let me share the things that I'm doing with this interesting tool so that some of my friends, when they ask me, why should I need this, I can send them the article. And I was lucky enough to actually connect with Ynab and get it published. And I remember Daniel found that article somehow, and he'll tell how he found it, and commented on that through Facebook. And we reconnected. We're like, oh my God, you also use Ynab. So of course, great conversations, and the connection was rekindled.
For a quick second, I didn't know it was you, Vanya, because you're Ivan Smirnov and you had this name change thing going on. So I was like, what are the chances that this is the same guy? And it was amazing. It was really, really cool. Yeah,
that's crazy. So Daniel, you had found Ynab. I mean, you ran into the blog, so you were looking. Had you already been using it? What was the story there?
Yeah, I've been using Ynab since 2016, right when you guys came out with the web only product. But my confession is that I'm in the personal finance space, and I'm a finance nerd by training. So I'm a CPA. I was an auditor at KPMG. And and I was
we share the same 4 letters. So
yeah. Oh, really? On the KPMG side?
Yes. Yeah.
Keep playing more golf, right?
What does that actually mean, though? I'm not sure.
Kleinveld, Piet Marwick, and Girdler.
I could not have named the first and the last.
Okay.
You got me on that.
For the non-finance nerds, which includes myself and probably most of our listeners, can you tell a little bit more about that?
Sure. There are 4 major accounting firms. There was a bunch of mergers that happened. I started in the late 90s. So at the time, and funny enough, my advisors and mentors in junior achievement were from Arthur Andersen. So this is like all this stuff.
This is
comes full circle.
Pre-explosion, basically.
Right. Pre-SOX, pre-Enron, all that stuff. I still have the pen they gave me. They gave me a cross pen in 2003. It has the KPMG logo on there with my name engraved for when I got my chartered accounting designation. But it was those mentors in JA that I looked up to, that I learned from. I was like, same question, Vanya. It's like, what is an auditor? Why do you need that? And I learned about attestation. I learned about fair representation. I learned about working with clients and fees and billing and all that stuff. And that just like opened my eyes. At the time, I realized that I was good at accounting and I liked it. So for 10 years of my career, that's what I did. And I finished that with working at eBay, actually. But after working at eBay and spending time as an accountant, I spent 5 years as a startup entrepreneur, Jesse, in the personal finance space. Raised some venture capital, focused on not personal finance issues, but more on the coaching side. Right. Started a company that really focused on helping people direct to consumer to help them answer their questions about finance, because content is great. Tools like Ynab are fantastic, but it doesn't necessarily bring everything together for certain individuals. And they need an extra level of personal training, I guess you could call it. I ended up, surprisingly, and luckily, landing a job at Quicken. So for 4 years, I was head of BD at Quicken, which is a personal finance software company. And it was through that experience that even before going to Quicken, I was already really into learning about the best tools that you can use. I just have a tremendous passion for personal finance myself, but like Vanya, also helping other people use it to help them achieve their own version of financial success, because everyone is different. And even in Ynab, like how you start and how you everyone's like categorization and budget looks different. It even changes over time. Like I just looked up the number of categories I have. I think it's 40. And the number of different accounts I have, because I'm Canadian and I have IRAs everywhere and 401ks and stuff, is 60. And I'm constantly thinking about, how do I make this simpler? Because it's getting more complex. I have private equity investments, I have bonuses to accrue for, or taxes to set aside. And it's like, at some point, I don't want to be running QuickBooks. Like, that's not what I want to do. I want to live my life, and I want a tool that helps me do that. And Ynab is great. That's what I use. That's my go-to for budgeting. I have your amazing widgets on my iPhone, so I'm always checking, what do I have left for groceries this month, or for shopping on Amazon, which is primarily where I'm doing my shopping now. And and for me, similar to Vanya, the big aha moment for me on why Ynab works so well, I'm gonna be a little nerdy here because you have an accounting background.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is, you guys take from the beginning a balance sheet approach. Every other budgeting app takes a P&L approach. Let's forecast your monthly income and your monthly expenses. And what's interesting, especially in this year of the pandemic and for working American families, we've realized that every month is full of surprises.
Yeah.
You can have unexpected expenses. You could be furloughed. You could have reduced hours. You could not get that promotion you were expecting and that raise. And budgeting for things you are super uncertain about versus, hey, what cash do I have? How do I assign jobs to the cash I already have is the right approach. And it dawned on me by using Ynab that the P&L is simply a function of the balance sheets, the change in retained earnings, period. So starting from those first principles gives you a sense of, I know, I can actually assign with confidence what I have because I have it. And that's been fantastic. I love that approach. It's hard to learn, even as an accountant. But once it clicks, it sticks for life. So I'm very happy that you guys take that approach.
It's been interesting because when I first came up with it, it wasn't because I thought about it in that way. I had just learned debits and credits, at the time, but I just thought, well, here's what we have on hand, and never gave it another thought. It was, I kind of just stumbled into it, but we've realized that that is a stumbling block for a lot of people in that forecasting and then being wrong and then saying budgeting doesn't work. So that it's absolutely true. It's interesting also that where most businesses fail is with their cash position at the end of the day. And where most families feel the crunch is obviously in cash. And so what we're doing is just obsessing people. We're getting people obsessed over cash because that is the failure point. A business doesn't fail because they have, too little AR. At the end of the day, you're always like, well, is the AR being converted into cash? What does that cycle look like? It's always cash. So it's interesting as, you come full circle 15, 17 years later and you're like, oh, I'm even still understanding it and, in different ways or at different depths than when we first got going with it. So even in our own product,
you're still learning by trying things. I mean, I had to unlearn the accrual method. It's it's a cruel world, but not for personal finance, right? It's about cash on hand, and especially for working American families. I mean, people who are living paycheck to paycheck, you have to pay attention to what you have on hand and what is certain, and that helps you decide with comfort, right? So we had to switch to accrual when we moved to our SaaS model, obviously. And then last year at our exec meeting, we all just kind of said, okay, when we say revenue, we mean cash. Just so, because we kept saying, well, do you mean accrual revenue or cash? I mean, it was just such a joke. And so we're like, all right, from now on here at Ynab, revenue means cash. And the only time we talk about accrual is when we're doing taxes, Right.
So
right.
Because the decision making was always cash anyway. And there
right. Well, you got to throw ARR in there, and then you got to throw bookings in there. and retention.
And then you're like, okay, now we don't even know. Like, and someone's saying one thing, you're like, are you saying this or that? And it's a big mess.
Well, it's interesting. I want to touch on the cash moment. We kind of mentioned how with working families, they have to get familiar with cash. And I think there's a lot to unpack here because there is so much fear of finances that I see. And I especially encounter this when I try to get some of my friends to either use Ynab specifically or just think about the budget. And there's this visceral physical reaction of, no, we're not talking about it. And we're not talking about it not because they don't want to share their numbers with me. We're very transparent. But they're afraid to face their reality because sometimes that reality might not be what they think it is, or it forces them to confront that, hey, you're not on the path to meet your goals and you need to change that. And that is a very scary confrontation. So then the question becomes is, how do we have a conversation to enable somebody to take an honest look at their finances by detaching judgment? Because the moment you try to do judgment or compare like, oh my gosh, you have 10 times more than I do, like, no, that's a horrible path to go on. But being honest and saying, look, this is what I have. These are my goals. How do we change things to get to these goals? Or maybe we change the goals. And I think that's always a very interesting conversation to have.
We do the same thing with couples when we're counseling couples, it's just, well, we don't need to talk about money. Let's just talk about goals for a bit, maybe for a couple hours. It's amazing how many couples haven't had meaningful conversations just around that side of things. And then you can, by extension, if you're, running solo, you could just say, well, have you even had a good hard think about what you want? And in your 20s, you're running so fast sometimes you don't really have a moment to think about what you actually want. You're just going and going. But at some point along the way, everyone has to kind of establish those goals first. How do you either one of you can answer this, but you both are, when we talk to a lot of people that we're doing these money stories, they earn a more, I'll just say, typical income. People can interpret that how they want, but you both we would classify as high income earners. So there are different scenarios that Vanya, you highlighted in that blog post. Just brass tacks. How do you handle something like a large inflow that comes from a bonus or something?
Yeah, I can jump on that. So I've learned that you can't expect bonuses. You aren't entitled to them. If the company has a great year, hopefully they will pay you the bonus that they said they might pay you, but until it shows up, it's not actually yours. So I'm lucky enough that most of my bonuses typically come in at the beginning of the year. So I will look at them and take a look at my portfolio and see where are the gaps. And typically that means, okay, I have to fund my 401k because I haven't done that yet. Maybe I fund some of my other retirement accounts, and then I will take my inflows and I typically keep a 3-month cash buffer because I think in my industry, I'm lucky enough that if something happens to my primary employment within 3 months, I should be able to arrange an alternative. So anything that's over that immediately goes into my financial independence category. And then from there, it's kind of proportionally apportioned into stock investing, real estate investing, or some of the alternative investments that I'm exploring recently.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, it sounds, that's pretty, no surprises there, at least to me. Daniel, anything different, or is that kind of typical for you?
Yeah, I like what you said, Vanya, about I don't count on bonuses. And if you're following the Ynab approach, you can't because you don't have cash on hand yet. So there's nothing to account for. So it works itself out. Now, in terms of like what to do with it once it shows up, I hate leaving stuff in the to be budgeted category. It just like bothers me. Like it's there and I need to address it. So I do have like a stasis, I put money somewhere and I get to decide what to do with it. And I think the answer is it depends on everyone's different personal situation, who they are and where they are. Even for me, over the past couple of years, it's changed dramatically. I mean, the year of COVID made me think about things very differently.
Yeah.
I have a separate fund. I don't call it an emergency fund. I call a backup income fund. It's literally to replace income because my wife and I are both at startups. And even if you're at a stable company, the past year has shown that job stability is different or can be different depending on the economic cycle. So we actually put aside 6 months, which is north of 6 figures of cash, right? And that gives, and to your point, Jesse, it's like that conversation about how to get to that number is not a spreadsheet. Not really. That's not where you start. It's you start with risk tolerance, comfort. What do you need that money for? So my risk tolerance is much higher than my wife's. Like I'm willing to go crazy. She's secure. She needs that security. So that's what we solve for. I have 2 young kids, 2 amazing boys who are 7 and 4 years old. I need to think about them now differently from when it was just by myself, and I could, do the startup thing by myself and have no dependence. So what we did last year, to your point, was I did have some liquidity events that were unexpected. I bolstered my savings fund. I made it as, to the point where it's obtuse, where I look at it, I'm like, is that really efficient?
Yeah.
Yeah. We strive for this like optimization thing. And then I have to remind myself, yes, it is. It's because I have this safe cushion that I can take some of my investments and swing for the fences. So from an asset allocation perspective, I'm barbell. Like I've got 85%.
Love it.
Yeah. I've got 85% of my investments in like target date funds that are low cost, cash or near cash. And then I've got 15% that's in stuff like venture capital, private equity, startups, Dogecoin. Thankfully, I bought that 4 years ago.
Oh gosh,
that was surprising. Yeah, I didn't expect that. I thought I was going to lose it all. But that gives us both the comfort, but the flexibility. I think that's what's amazing about budgeting that people don't realize is, you're right, Vanya, people react allergically to the word budget because they think immediately constraint, restriction. I can't do what I want to do. And it's not that. It really is a tool to help you choose what you want to do and have that control. So we start our conversations about values. What is your relationship with money? Where do you fear it? What do you want to do with it? And then we look at priorities. And for me and my wife, that's being parents now first.
Yeah.
So, even though I work at a startup now, it's a well-funded startup backed by Andreessen Horowitz and Trinity Ventures and Comcast Ventures. So, it's a measured
stable-esque startup. Like it's not it's not a hair on fire startup, right?
Exactly. I've done that, and I like my hair, so I want to keep it now. But that's the approach. I guess one tactical suggestion would be that I do for liquidity events is I put aside the tax immediately as a liability, as a tracking account. I literally call it IRS payable, and it's tracked in Ynab. It's not a separate like account, but it's part of my like cash amount. And then at the end of the year, I do a reconciliation. I ask my CPA to come up with a tax liability estimate for the year, and then I prepay my gap plus $10,000 because I want to be a little conservative, expecting a small refund in April. And that could be a surprise. That could be a pretty, decent amount. Like last year was $50K for me in November. But you don't want to be surprised. So like, again, because I have that flexibility and planning, I'm able to move my budget around. Sometimes it's between budget items and tracking items. And that visibility is super, super helpful.
Yeah. So you're using Ynab as kind of a heads up display on things. You're seeing high level. Do Vanya, on your side of things where you're doing the investment stuff, a lot of times people will use a budget to track kind of the minutia. Have you found that your relationship to minutia has evolved over time? Just maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It has definitely evolved because as I've been lucky enough to have my net worth grow, the kind of small movements don't matter as much. So I'm definitely still faithful to the Ynab philosophy as far as my actual cash balances. So I know down to $1 for last year of how much I spent on going out versus flights. As far as investments though, you really have to be detached from those because a lot of folks, they get emotional when they see a massive dip. Like in March of 2020, there was a massive drop and, it happens. And in my case, I do a reconciliation every week for my cash accounts and every month for my investment accounts. And I remember in March, I almost had this emotional reaction of like, ooh, maybe I don't want to reconcile this thing because I'll have to kind of make this loss official. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. So I absolutely do not track individual stock purchases or anything. I have the investment platforms for the cost basis. So I will keep it simple. I'll just copy paste the value of the account into the Ynab reconciliation flow and just have it auto update, and I'll tag it. Yep, stock market went up or stock market went down.
Yeah. So your categorization is essentially an up or a down, or are you categorizing it to the same? Just to change in market is essentially the category.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
as the delta changes, and then separately, I will track my inflows into that account. So that way in the reporting screen, I can do a breakdown to see, okay, how much did I inflow into this account and what was the market delta? Because otherwise the performance is slightly skewed.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Daniel, anything to add there on just kind of the minutia of the budget? You said you had 40 categories. You've probably, I think I have 10. So
I keep consolidating them. I mean, like just this last quarter, I used to have a separate category for each of my household help. So babysitter, gardener, housekeeper, and my kids' tutor. And, a couple $100 set aside for each one per month. And then I realized, like, why? Like, let's just call it one thing. I did the same thing with my subscriptions. So Ynab, Amazon, Netflix, Peloton, etc. I've consolidated it all. But that's not a complaint. I actually wanted that level of minutia visibility and choosing individual emojis for each one, by the way, to get comfort around it before I collapsed it. So I was like, you know what? This is good enough. 3 months, let's say. Now I can collapse it and make it simpler. I think there's still more room to do that. I mean, hearing that you've got 10 tells me I could make it even simpler. And it goes back to like materiality, right? To your point, avoiding minutia, even though on one hand, it's the small things that add up. Once you find comfort in a system to make the big boulders move forward, then it works for itself and it's a better use of time. So for example, my favorite report in Ynab beyond the day-to-day stuff is the net worth report. I see this, bar chart, which shows from a macro view how things are going. And that's all that really matters. Like I'm not looking for alpha on my investments. I recognize that asset allocation is the most important decision I can make. My investments personally of my time is in my job, my career, my personal development, and my kids. Like that's where I want to spend the majority of my time. Now I am a little bit different than most users because I'm a personal finance nerd. I use multiple products. So Ynab is clearly my go-to for everything day-to-day budgeting, but I use Personal Capital for looking at my investments and my asset allocation. And I'm a huge Quicken user. I use Quicken for tax reporting and bespoke reports because you can run all sorts of complicated stuff in Quicken. It's just super powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's not my budgeting tool. So, that's where it's evolved. I still have Excel from time to time.
Yeah.
So, but that's where I started. Like, funny enough, you just reminded me when I was telling my Ynab story. I used to run a version of Ynab in Excel, which was downloading CSVs from my banks because I had fewer bank accounts back then, and then categorizing using pivot tables, and then comparing to a calendar view of where cash was going out so I could forecast it. And it was just so prone to error and it couldn't scale. Like it just, when I found Ynab, I was blown away with like, wow, somebody has built and automated a system that was working for me. And with linked accounts, I'm a linked account fan. I know many people are manual users. Agreed. I just have too many transactions. I mean, I do like 150 transactions a week. I can't keep up with it. So, and I love that you guys use two different aggregators on the back end because everyone's connectivity is different. I used to have Capital One, which does not work with one of the big aggregators.
No, it does not. It's I think we've made progress there actually recently, but I don't keep up. That it is a quagmire of you can get me. Don't, you've triggered me. Don't trigger me on this.
Well, here's a shout out. Ryan Caldwell, MX, awesome team. Love those guys.
I love Ryan.
Yeah. And I personally switched to MX on the back end, and the accounts that I've chosen, the FIs I work with, it's working great.
Yeah.
So
okay. Good. Yeah. It is nice to have some fallbacks, and honestly, there are some that work better with others, and which is weird. But so I might be giving away something I shouldn't on the podcast, but we're working on dialing in this account. This institution works better here, and actually, it's a little more, not a little, it's more expensive for us, but we can kind of a la carte put a user in with multiple aggregators and then get the best of those worlds.
That's actually great to hear, because on the forums there's been a lot of chatter and everyone's like, we know it's hard, but obviously some accounts work better with one. So that'll be great.
And from our side, we're like, man, why is this? But it's just, you said at some point you're like, this is our reality until we can like standardize and open things up. And we're, you know, OAuth is becoming a thing, which is fantastic. So we're moving in the right direction. We're a little slower than the EU was on getting to this, but
we have way more FIs. We have 10,000 plus different financial institutions, including like the $500 million credit unions that don't have any support. So that's part of the problem. OAuth is interesting because once it's similar to getting started with Ynab, once you get over that hump and friction, it is amazing. 100% connectivity success. But onboarding is different. You jump out to the website, you get a token, and everyone is different. Wells is different from Chase. It's like different from screen scraping.
I want to touch about kind of the evolution and onboarding. So hearing you folks chat about the number of categories, I think it's important to note that this changes with time. So one of my initial goals with Ynab was figure out where the heck is my money going? And you can't do that with 10 categories or even 40. I believe I started with maybe 70. I think I'm down to 50 these days. And as time goes on, I know that some of my expenses are just relatively fixed. But in the beginning, it's tremendously useful to know, okay, this is how much you're spending on restaurants. This is how much you're spending on movies. And having that information, you're forced to confront that reality that, hey, I spent $500 a month on restaurants. How do I feel about that? Am I happy with that or not? And then the trade-off is, okay, well, I got to see my friends and build relationships, so I'm probably happy about that, but maybe I can host them for dinner. But after a few years of, as you learn these systems, you know that these are just kind of baseline expenses that probably aren't going anywhere. You can fold them in. The risk that I see there, though, is it is easy to kind of have one of them creep up and you don't really notice if it's kind of folded into one category. So it's always an interesting balance of kind of avoiding the risk of lifestyle inflation. I've certainly noticed that with my choice of housing as I'm kind of living in nicer and nicer apartments. Like my current one actually has AC, which I'm very excited about. It's not common here in the Bay Area and I love it. But, you know, that's a line item that is steadily increasing. And it's always interesting to see that evolution of both your expenses and the way you categorize.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, last year I did a very aggressive experiment that I'm not even ready to really share publicly, but it involved a lot of black box spending in the sense that I had very little visibility. Because my thinking was, hey, you know, Julie and I have been doing this for 16, 17 years. We're good. You know, like we can just kind of hold something. You always are, like what you said, Daniel, pushing the boulders, making sure those are moving. That all happens before our cash ever hits the budget. So when I thought, well, yeah, we're winning on the big goals, check. And I didn't like it. I personally, I just did not like the lack of visibility. And so this year I tried to say, well, let me try and find a happy middle. My rule for this, or kind of heuristic at least, is if the information would change your behavior, then you may want to track it. But if knowing it wouldn't change it, don't worry about it. And you might have a suspicion like, oh, if I found out I was spending $2,000 eating out every month, I would change. Then maybe track it for a little bit and see. But if you don't intend change, a lot of times people will they're kind of like, oh, I should track this. I should know this. Well, knowing it may not change your behavior. So that's kind of a gauge for me. But you're right, Vanya, it's an evolution, and my pendulum seems to swing back and forth. I'm on one side right now, and we'll see where we land, you know, somewhere later.
I like that litmus test. That might even be a blog post on different approaches, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about, hey, you know, I have a bunch of fixed expenses that don't change easily. My rent, my car insurance, my cell phone bill. I could just collapse all of those and just call it monthly household expenses.
Yeah.
But then you said, but if I saw that information, would it change my behavior? Well, guess what? Car insurance. I'm not driving anywhere anymore. Why am I paying so much? So if I didn't have that visibility, I wouldn't have called up Geico and gotten an extra $200 off every 6 months, which I did last week. Thankfully, because Ynab highlighted to me that I had these true expenses saved up, but I could recapture a little bit of it because I was paying for more than I needed because I was, not driving as much anymore. So that's a really good point. I like that a lot.
Well, it's really great to see the intentionality here. And I think Ynab is kind of interesting in budgeting in general because it forces you to be intentional with your money, just like a time management system forces you to be intentional with your time. And the first step in either of those systems is awareness. And then the second step is evaluation of, are you happy where this is going? And the third step is change.
Well, that's Vanya. You should have a podcast because I feel like you're really nice. You just nail it. You're like concise. I
Thank you.
talk around stuff all the time. You get to the heart of it. I love it.
Thank you.
Vanya, what are your current goals? So what's the budget done for you lately? I like to ask people.
Great question. So my goal is to hit financial independence within the next 7 years. And this
Excellent.
doesn't mean I want to retire and just chill on the beach. I will absolutely continue working because I'm lucky enough to love what I do, but I want to have the opportunity to do more risky ventures or work at startups or maybe try more aggressive angel investing. So I'm actually using Ynab primarily as a tracking tool where I will look at the reports, specifically the delta in the net worth and my outflows and inflows, and kind of see how my progress is going. I also, as I mentioned, have a whole category group called financial independence, and
Yeah.
it is my goal to save at least 50% of my post-tax income. And of course, things change constantly, but it's very useful to open up that pie chart view and see just how much I'm putting away, because coming back to the intentionality, that forces me to think, okay, I'm going to buy a fancy new mechanical keyboard. That's going to set me back from this goal. And what is that trade-off there?
Yeah.
So kind of optimizing net worth. And it's actually been a very interesting journey because as I mentioned, I'm very open about these things with my friends because I want them to succeed. And I've noticed after a few years of kind of pushing them and saying, hey, here's what I'm doing, here are the tools, they've started doing it too. And just the other day, I had a friend call me, she's like, dude, I just crossed 250K net worth. And I was like, yes, this is fantastic. It doesn't matter if my net worth is 10 times more, 10 times less. We're still absolutely incredible friends. And it's the journey and that passion and the excitement that really gets me going to see like, hey, you're getting closer to your goals. Isn't that great?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Daniel, what about you? You mentioned your focus has changed. You got these 4-year-old, 7-year-old little boys.
Yeah.
So I get that. Tell me how what's the budget done for you lately regarding goals? And I don't know, you're growing up, and we're saying so.
I am. Two major, beyond the regular budgeting stuff, which is where Ynab is the most powerful, which I love, the true expenses. I'm focusing on bigger picture items. One, my wife and I still have student debt, and we went to expensive MBA programs while I was an entrepreneur making minimum wage. So I've racked up a bunch of student debt. Thankfully, it's at a pretty low rate, and we've decided that it's not worth paying off in chunks because that cash buffer that we have is more important, especially since dropping balloon payments doesn't reduce the monthly fee unless you re-amortize and all this other jazz, right? So there's that. Second is, we've really been thinking about home ownership. I live in Cupertino, which is where Apple is based, and it's super expensive. I won't tell you how much the house is that I live in. I rent it, and I wouldn't be able to afford it by owning it. You need to put down, almost 7 figures in down payment to get a conventional loan, right? Plus a ridiculous monthly payment that just ties you down. So similar to Vanya, my goal is to achieve financial freedom so that I can swing even bigger. And I already swing big, so I'm not worried about that as much, but so I can swing bigger with my family to do so. When I mean by swing bigger, I mean taking on more risk or even leaving it all on the table with my job. As in, I'm like Vanya, super happy to have found a role that works really well for me. I currently lead BD at a company called Brightside, and we're bringing financial care and financial health solutions to working American families at some of the largest employers in the United States. And that's amazing. I love that I can actually use my skills for good, to help Main Street and not Wall Street is one way to put it.
Yeah.
And I want that for my kids too. I can't say with confidence yet that they can go to any school that they want to when they're 18, for example. Yeah. I can't say that with certainty I know where I'm going to be living. And that's part of the comfort conversation that I have with my wife. She really wants to buy a home. And I'm like, well, and I dig into why. And she's like, well, we never get asked to leave. We never have to worry about rent hikes because, those things are real. Right. So balancing the qualitative with the quantitative is my primary goal right now, but it keeps moving. So I'm not as specific as Vanya. I don't have a 7-year time frame for financial freedom. I could argue that I have that already. I just can't live here to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's the case. I mean, if you go to Thailand, you need a very low amount of money to live
Let's
like
do
an
it,
absolute king.
Vanya.
But, you know, like you point out, I also live in the Silicon Valley, and I mean, yeah, it's whenever I share how much I make, my friends are like, "Oh my God, you must be a millionaire," and I'm like, "Well, here's what my rent is," and they're like, "Oh my God, how are you alive?"
Yeah, it really, I mean, well, the geo arbitrage thing pops up in that situation. You know, you both are living one end of it, and there's the other end, which Thailand is like almost the like cliche example of the geo arbitrage situation, you know, where you could just say, I'll live, but you can also go to the middle of the country here and you found some arbitrage, you know, not quite so.
Are you in Utah, Jesse? I'm just curious.
Yeah. And to be frank, it feels like the coast is slowly approaching us in that regard. Like we're doing really well attracting people for all of the reasons you mentioned, Daniel, as far as just, you know, affordability, stability, good education, all the things that you're looking at in kind of the macroeconomic views. And I sit here, of course, when you move to a place, you're always the last person that should come, and then everyone else should stay away, you know? So I'm like, okay, now that we're here, we want to be the last people, but no, you know, things keep growing but it's interesting to watch. And part of last year, we saw a lot of people kind of say, hey, I want to slow down a little bit and have the lifestyle expenses. I mean, I say lifestyle, that has carries too much with it. Standard just living costs quite a bit lower. Taxes obviously lower, you know, and things like that. So
I'm curious, you mentioned good education. I know we touched upon junior achievement earlier. What are your thoughts on financial education for young students? The reason I ask that is, at no point during my entire educational career did I ever sat down and explained like, hey, here's what a credit card is. Of course, Daniel with junior achievement brought that to certain students, but there's an interesting fundamental gap in the United States educational system where we release what we think are fully baked adults into the world who have no idea what a credit score is and that credit cards aren't free money. So any thoughts on how we bridge that gap to kind of bring more financial knowledge to everybody?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, one of the reasons that I think it doesn't take from a market perspective, why don't we have companies that go in and see it as a profitable venture, is that these students don't yet have the pain, I'll say pain, that makes them think they need a budget. So you might have, like, Utah's actually leads the pack as far as financial education goes, but I don't necessarily see it translate into a lot better behavior with the 18, 19-year-old crowd. So a lot of times people need a little bit of like a wake up call, which you had, Vanya. You mentioned you sat down with someone and you just saw the difference, and you're like, wait a minute, it was this event for you, you know?
Exactly.
And if Ynab could be present at all of those little conversations that happen all the time, where we would say, hey, we could help you do this, we would be there. But high school students don't have any bills yet, really, and they just don't feel it. And I think that's one of the reasons we haven't seen a market solution. That being said, our Ynab for Good initiative that we've rolled out last year, we're hopeful that we could find organizations that are doing it, and we donate subscriptions and can kind of facilitate it as a tool that they can use in perpetuity. So I think there are attempts made. Ramsey Solutions has, I think it's called, I don't remember what the product's called, but they have a school curriculum solution but you haven't seen mass adoption. And it does always get me a little bit when you see very large players like Visa, MasterCard, that they're the major sponsors of whatever education is happening. I think, okay, I mean, I'm an optimist, but there's some bias there in how we train and what we say as far as what's necessary and needful. So there's a bit of that in there too, where I think the incumbents can use that as a way to kind of keep the pipeline full, so to speak, you know. So yeah. I don't know, Daniel, you have any comment on that? I mean, you mentioned, you, as far as educating and helping Main Street versus Wall Street, and this kind of seems to land in that spot.
It does. It's interesting. So because I was, I moved to the States in my late 20s, and I was raised in Toronto, Canada. I did learn about what a check was and what a credit card was in high school. It was part of the curriculum. And it's funny, I also know stochastic calculus and algebra and geometry and all this other stuff that I don't use, right? And when I realize that that's not part of our system here, my bottom line is I wouldn't wait for the government to fix it. I mean, how else to put it, right? Private enterprise that finds a way to create knowledge that there's a hunger for will find a business model eventually at some point. But you're right, Jesse. It's like, it's not obvious. And the pain thing is super interesting because as a dad, I want to teach my kids certain amounts of pain now so that they can make smaller mistakes today so they avoid the big mistakes later. One example is, so I've also used Every Dollar and Good Budget and everything else, like all the personal finance apps. And a lot of the principles that Financial Peace University has for helping kids out is really interesting. I literally just implemented yesterday a whiteboard on my fridge, just magnetic whiteboard, and I put down certain chores that my kids will get 25 cents for doing every day. But I also put down chores that they're going to get jack for because it's their duty and their responsibility.
Yeah.
Right. Your homework, brushing your teeth, things like that. I'm not going to pay you for that. But if you go beyond and you recognize that there's this connection between reward and hard work, and then eventually, I haven't gotten to this point yet, trade-offs about when the money's gone, it's gone. Like that box, that's a clear plastic box with dollar bills in it, eventually, hopefully right now it's very, very sparse, is going to act as their first introduction to how Ynab works, right? It's like cash-based budgeting. It's balance sheet only. They got nothing else. And once they take that and buy popcorn with it, they can't go back and change their minds. So that's what I'm trying to think about. Now, it is the parents' responsibility to do that, but unfortunately, most parents don't have that education themselves.
Yeah.
Right. So I'd love to learn more about the Ynab for Good initiative. That sounds amazing. I think it's going to be really helpful.
Yeah, ynab.com/good is where we kind of roll out. We just partner with 501c3s that have a financial literacy component, and we've budgeted for a number of subscriptions that we can give away each year. And we launched it last year in June, I think. And it was a little bit of a slow start, and then we got our guy Cody, who works. He's down in Florida, and he was like, "I want to run this thing," and now he's blowing it up. So
awesome.
We just had a blog post today highlighting a place in Portland where they have this. It's like a food pantry / gardening. You volunteer a little bit, you pay a little bit, and you get a whole lot more as far as like a food pantry. It's awesome. And so we're part of that, where these families get some financial literacy training, and Ynab's there as a tool for them. It's pretty cool, pretty fun. I lost my thread on what I was going to speak to. One thing specifically that you mentioned, Daniel, but maybe it'll come up.
It'll come back. I was going to say and suggest. So I used to be on the advisory board of Junior Achievement of Silicon Valley, and Vanya and I know people there. It would be interesting to see what. I haven't been in touch ever since I had my second kid. Honestly, been too busy. But I'm curious what Jay's approach to financial literacy education is at the grade school level now, and whether or not Ynab for Good could be part of that. So I think that would be a fun conversation. And what I'm getting at, Vanya, is I want to co-teach some classes with you. That's what I want.
It'd be really fun.
That'd be awesome.
Lesson plans already in the works. That would be great.
Well, we are. I'm giving away so many things I shouldn't on the podcast, but the idea of Ynab for kids, like how kids should interact with it. I mean, my kids start when they're 8, and I'm punching in numbers for them, and then a couple years later, they're sitting there and they're the pilot. But it's it's not a kid-friendly experience, and we're well aware of that. And I think we could see even a market opportunity there for us, where we say, "Oh, we can grow here. This is something that parents would." Or caretakers would happily provide. There's even some interesting things, not to put down the partner that's reluctant, but some partners in this running money, they don't want to see every category. They don't want to see all 40 or 50 or 10 even. They care about 3. And so we've done a lot of research there on how partners use the budget together, and some just like, I care about a few, and then he or she does all the rest, and it works for them. So there's interesting things on how partners do it, and I see kids, like children and parents, essentially as some form of partnership early on, and how the app could be built and kind of made to facilitate that, in a more meaningful, productive way. We want to see behavior change. And like you said, Daniel, we want to see them avoid big mistakes, make a lot of small, harmless mistakes, when you're little.
Mm-hmm.
And then you don't get suckered into that credit card and t-shirt on campus, years later.
That was my first credit card, GM Visa.
There you go.
And then I realized the only GM car I would want is the Corvette, and it would take me so long to get 5% rewards to make a dent on the down payment for a Corvette. So, but you're right. Like here's my phone, right there, the 3 categories I care about the most because I have the most discretion over them. So that's a great example. And I'm excited to see how we help our kids learn to budget and how to use Ynab. And I think it's not just about the infrastructure, multi-tenant architecture, different logins, whatever, on the tech side, but the learning side. You said behavior change, and I agree with you, Jesse. Behavior change for adults, but for kids, it's behavior installation.
It's blank slate. It's beautiful.
Let's build it. That's the best time to do it too. Like fixing stuff is so much harder than clean slating stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we have all these band-aids around healthcare. Like what would we do if we just didn't have all that baggage? That's what we have with our kids when it comes to teaching them budgeting. So
if you were to describe the system now and say, oh, we're going to build this, everyone will be like, I don't think you should build that system. So I had a friend explain Bitcoin to me that way. He's like, if we were to build it and describe it, and he describes it to me, he's like, we would do it differently. And I was like, oh, I like that. That's kind of an interesting thought exercise, on how to approach the architecture of something.
I do that with my budget. In the past 5 years, I've blown away my budget and started from scratch again. Like outside of the on-ramping period, I want to say once every year and a half, roughly.
Yeah.
And it sometimes shows up where I just want a fresh start. It just feels good. And maybe now's the time because I have too many categories. So
you have just the right amount for you right now.
You're right.
That's it. So I call it the budget burn down. It's an annual thing for us. We do it every year. It's because you get to question everything,
Oh yeah, that was a great post of yours. Really enjoyed reading that one. I like what we're talking about though here, and I think there's some space to discuss the kind of access to knowledge aspect, because even with the kids, we have folks like, Jesse and Daniel who can sit down their kids and create this intentional program to teach them. I've been lucky enough to stumble into this, and I've been educating my friends. But what's interesting is you really require this access to knowledge to the first person who's going to give you that wake up call and say, hey, this exists, like these apps exist. This is something you should be thinking about. And the question then becomes is, how do we break down this barrier so that more people get that initial trigger to explore this particular space?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I don't want to lean too much on the Ynab for good thing, but there are organizations and kind of boots on the ground situations where we don't have the visibility, the knowledge of kind of just getting our knowledge foot into that door, where we say, oh, we can be there. We simply aren't there. And so it's fun to be able to partner with organizations where you're basically saying, well, you're there, you're at that knowledge spot, and we can just kind of be an assist in that way. But on the, you've started to kind of change my tune a little bit on the education front, because I have a little bit of like a woe is me. And when you get into like big public type of efforts, of course, that's how you feel all the time. But I need to pause on that and kind of question my initial reaction, because I haven't had a different reaction to that for a decade, and I maybe should, question that.
Clean slate.
Yeah. Like, do this again. What would you do?
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. You find someone that's been able to sell some LMS into schools. You say, well, a lot of people. How did you crack that? And have them try and get the curriculum in there. I mean, heck, you don't even have to make money on it for the first 5 years. You can just, I don't know, the kid, there would be ways to get the business model to fund itself, I think, over time.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. This has been a great conversation. So Vanya, Daniel, where can people go if they want more of either of you? Is there anywhere they go, or do you just kind of lay low? What's the story?
So I guess I can take this one. So I have two blogs. The first one is ivans.io. That's IVANS.io. And that's a small blog where I just post little snippets. My second blog is more long form, which is blog.ivansmirnov, IVANSMIRNOV.name, NAME. And I try to share my knowledge there. And I'm also open via LinkedIn or email because I love meeting new folks and kind of helping them get started or just chatting about things. So always happy to say hello.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you, Vanya. What about you, Daniel?
That's all. I was just reminded, Vanya, of your blog of your travels. Like that's really cool. So yeah, for me, I'm on Twitter. You can find me at Chen Enthusiast. So enthusiast with a CH in front of it. And of course, I'm super active on LinkedIn. So to find me, look up Daniel A. Chen, A middle initial. And I don't remember there's no handle on LinkedIn. I think it's Daniel A. Chen all in one. Yeah. But I used to have a blog. It was MBA couple. So my wife and I were both journaling like what it was like. She was at Columbia, I was at Wharton, and we were like cross comparing. Man, I don't know how you keep up a blog, Vanya. It's just like so much work, but a labor of love, right?
That's a whole separate conversation about time management and all the things that we're doing among just this podcast and everything else, but we're out of time for that.
Podcast seems more fun. You just talk in real time and live in the moment. That's
exactly.
It's more fun that way.
Yeah.
Well, it's been nice to meet both of you, honestly, for the first time and connect in that way. And let me know. You guys can reach out to me anytime, Jesse at Ynab.com. That's for all listeners, but specifically, I'm talking to you two right now that I'm looking at. And awesome. Yeah, reach out if you need anything from me or if there's anything of interest, So, well, thanks so much. This has been a great conversation. And I'm glad that we could have two high income earners that come on and kind of speak frankly about, hey, here's how we do stuff. And there are a lot of listeners that are thinking, all right, that's pretty helpful because I'm in the same boat. And I love that we can give that advice as well. So have a good rest of your week, gentlemen. And hopefully we'll be able to meet maybe in person at some point,
Yeah. Vanya, are you back in the Bay Area?
I am, and I'll be driving across all of the United States. So maybe I'll do a little detour into Utah to say hello.
Absolutely. Do stop by, knock, and I'll answer the door and then we can chat or something. So yeah, absolutely. Definitely don't drive by here without coming by. You have to drive by me. I know this.
All right. I'll get your address offline so we don't have a bunch of happy viewers and fans showing up to give you presents.
Like, hey, I heard you tell Vanya, so here I am,
Yep.
All right. Okay. Thanks, gentlemen. We'll talk to you later. Have a great rest of your week.
This was fantastic. Thank you so much, Jesse. Right. Take care.